makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
So I just saw probably the stupidest video that I've ever seen from Kulinski, and the bar is pretty low. I don't really have much respect for him as a political analyst, and much less as a foreign policy analyst, because I've always gotten the impression of him that he's kind of a closet tankie. He rehashes sort of almost the exact same talking points you see from tankies, just not as overtly as you would expect from someone who has like sickle and hammer and North Korean flag emojis on their Twitter handles. So he made a video called On the Brink of World War III, and I'm going to basically debunk it because there's a lot of false statements, including his main argument at the end is based on a factually incorrect interpretation of history. And also, a lot of his arguments have a counter argument using his own logic that basically debunks it. So it's just bad arguments and bad facts. So let's watch this.
So the good news is that they're talking. And according to Anthony Blinken, the talks are direct and open and businesslike, and nobody's playing hide the ball. But at the same time, both sides are kind of playing hide the ball in a different sense because as Russia is insisting, look, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to go into Ukraine. They've amassed, I read, up to 100,000 troops on the border. And on the U.S. side, we say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. We're not involved. We're not interested in a conflict either. But we are sending weapons on top of weapons on top of weapons into Ukraine as well, and also into some of the surrounding post-Soviet states. So, and by the way, these things are viewed from both sides as red lines. So, like, the West doesn't want Russia to put any troops on the border, of course. And Vladimir Putin and the Russians don't want the U.S. to send weapons into states bordering Russia. I mean, how would we feel if Russia set up a bunch of missiles in Cuba? Seems like something like that may have happened at some point in history.
Okay, so here's the problem with this argument, and it's because he's basically using an is to justify an ought, and that is very problematic from an argumentative point of view. So he's saying that it is wrong that the U.S. is sending weapons to states that are neighboring Russia. And broadly speaking, he's later going to talk about NATO expansion. So that is wrong from his perspective. It is wrong for the US to be in a position very close to Russia in which it would be able to strike it militarily. But then he's basically justifying that this is wrong by using, this is an ought, by using an is, which is the fact that the US responded by nearly invading Cuba when it was apparent that Cuba was hosting Russian missiles, nuclear missiles, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this seems like a rather inconsistent application of principles, okay? So if you disagree that, or rather, if you're fine with the idea of sending missiles to a country neighboring another, then assuming this is like the State Department mentality, then you should have been okay with Russian missiles in Cuba, right? That's the consistent principle. Likewise, if you think this is a bad thing, then you also should have opposed Russia sending missiles to Cuba. And no tankie will ever argue that Russia sending nuclear missiles to Cuba was a bad thing. So you're being completely inconsistent here with these two things. And what he's using, like I said, the ought of the US should not be doing this, is being justified by the fact that the US did react when Russia did exactly the same thing. So you're either okay with missiles or any other weaponry next to your enemy, or you're not. Okay, there's no two sides to this, and he's basically taking the exact opposite, as tankies do, the exact opposite hypocrisy as the U.S. has done.
and we reacted in not such a great way. Tensions were so high, and we're lucky we escaped without an absolute cataclysm. How would we feel if Russia was funneling weapons into Mexico, and Mexico was an enemy state of ours? I don't think we'd like that very much. So
again, is or an ought. It would seem to me, if you are the kind of leftist who is in favor of the self-determination of peoples and the right of sovereign state to decide for themselves who they can ally with, then you should have no problem with Mexico allying itself with Russia or China or whatever. In fact, this is really the argument that kind of trumps the tankie argument. Because if in some point in the near future, Mexico was threatened by the US in the way that, say, Ukraine is being threatened by Russia, you're damn right that Mexico should have the right to ally itself with a foreign power in order to prevent anything from any conflict with the US from escalating. You're damn right it should have that. In fact, had Mexico had that option in 1846, maybe the outcome of the US-Mexican War would have been different. So, yeah, all states should have the right to ally themselves with whoever they want. And the inconsistency of this principle is that for tankies, apparently, if that ally is the US, then you're evil, and you're part of the evil US, NATO, West, Israel conspiracy. So this is just wrong. And again, if you're a leftist, the principle of self-determination, the principle of sovereignty is inviolable. You cannot violate this principle at all. The moment that you make exceptions because, it's okay to have a backyard if you're Russia. It's okay to have a sphere of influence if you're Russia. But if, the US does the same, no, that's imperialism. No. You better be damn consistent with what your definition of imperialism is. You better be damn consistent that things like spheres of influences and backyards are wrong. Just like Latin America is not the US's backyard and never should be, then the Ukraine should not be the Russia's backyard either. So complete inconsistency of principles here by tankies.
In order to understand this conflict, you have to understand the history of the region, because a lot of people, literally every mainstream media pundit, and of course every right-wing commentator, none of them will give you the history of what led to this. They just talk about it as if, usually the default assumption is like Vladimir Putin is Hitler and he's trying to take over, every area under the sun, and he has world domination goals, and so, anything we do to try to deter that is just and moral and righteous and virtuous. That seems to be the prevailing underlying narrative and assumption when people talk about this, but it really is not that simple. And it shouldn't surprise you guys in my audience to know that it's not that simple. So in an article in the New York Times, and credit to the New York Times for putting this line in there, although I will say there's an article that came out 2 or 3 days ago, and this line was way deep in the article, but nonetheless it's there. So they say, quote, Russia's demands include a legally binding halt to NATO's eastward expansion and a withdrawal of NATO troops from countries like Poland and Baltic nations that used to be aligned with or part of the Soviet Union. The United States has dismissed those demands as non-starters, even as American officials offered talks on other matters, such as military exercises and the placement of missiles.
So how is this not a violation of, again, a country's right to self-determination, country's sovereignty? How can you, apparently, according to tankies, you, the victim, Russia, impose on other countries a limitation of who they can ally with? If Poland decides that NATO and allying it, being part of NATO, is better for them in the longer run, why should Russia have any right in denying that to you? And the answer is it shouldn't. And again, this would be completely unacceptable to tankies if the roles were flipped. Because that's the problem with these people. They don't have principles at all. It's merely whatever the US does, bad. Whatever any enemy of the US does, good. No principles whatsoever.
Okay, so now also Biden is talking about, he's reviewing plans to send anywhere from 1,000 troops to 5,000 troops, U.S. troops, boots on the ground in the area near Russia's border. Okay, this is getting beyond crazy and reckless and dangerous, of course. So
What Kyle doesn't realize here, and this is should be pretty obvious to anyone who kind of understands how uh, Russian foreign policy works and how U.S. foreign policy in response to Russian foreign policy works. This brinkmanship has to be believable. If it's not believable, then there's no point. Russia does not want a war. I don't think Russia wants a war, and I also don't think the U.S. or NATO wants a war. But Russia has to make it as credible as possible that they're willing to take that extra step so that the West takes it seriously. Why? Because Russia is fundamentally weak relative to NATO. If you compare the military strengths of NATO and Russia, you will find that in almost every area of military power, the West is way more powerful. Way, way more powerful. And this is not to say that Russia is weak. By no stretch of the imagination is Russia weak. Russia could easily beat any other NATO country in a full shooting war, except for the U.S. There's no doubt in my mind about this, and they have in some areas of certain areas of military technology, they're on par, if not slightly better than the West. Not in all of them, but in a few. So it's not a country that should be taken lightly. It is a country that the West should respect in terms of its ability to engage militarily. But it is still fundamentally weaker than NATO. So what does the weaker party need to do to be on equal terms to the stronger one? And the answer is it should be willing to give a credible demonstration that it's willing to take an extra step that the West is not willing to take. And as long as Russia is always capable of doing that, then it will prevail in terms of achieving its foreign policy objectives. And so far it has done it. So it has been really successful at this. The game between Russia and NATO reminds me of something that you see very common in the animal kingdom. For example, you see cats and dogs when they fight. The cat very often wins or scares the dog away. And usually it's because we know that a cat and a dog, if they fought, the dog would probably win because of it's bigger, stronger, etc. But the cat is willing to use a level of force that the dog is not willing to use. So just because the cat is willing to use a greater scale of force than the dog is, it will win that encounter, because the outcome of that encounter is not to kill the other ones. They're not fighting to the death. They're just basically fighting for something, at that moment, stay off my turf or stay away from my food, whatever. It's not a life or death situation. So in this situation between countries, it's kind of similar. The weaker country has to show that it's willing to go further than what the other country, than what the West is willing to do. But then the West also needs to respond. It needs to make its own counter to Russian aggression seem credible. And that's the brinkmanship. And I disagree that in this scenario, it will necessarily lead to World War III. I don't think there is any impetus whatsoever on the Russian side to use nuclear weapons in this case. That there is a risk of a shooting war, yes. But World War III, I'm not quite sure that we will get to that point.
Here's what happened. When the Soviet Union broke up, in other words, when the West won the Cold War, we gave our word to Russia. Look, we're not going to expand NATO any closer to your border. That was part of the post-Soviet Union deal when we broke up the Soviet Union and created all of the post-Soviet states.
When we broke up the Soviet Union, the US broke up the Soviet Union? It didn't break up on its own? This is very weird interpretation of history, but that's not the problematic part. The real problematic part, and I said it from the start of this video, that there is one thing that Kyle said that is factually incorrect, and his entire analysis is based on that. And it's this idea that there was an agreement between NATO and Russia shortly after the dissolution of the USSR that led to this agreement led to, I guess, some sort of negotiation, something written, or maybe a a gentleman's agreement that NATO would not expand into the former Warsaw Pact or the former ex-Soviet states. And that is factually wrong. There is no treaty that has been signed and no gentleman's agreement that anyone is aware of where this deal happened. And I'm going to show you the official text. There was a treaty between NATO and Russia in 1997, which is called the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And this treaty basically just establishes the template of the relationships between NATO and Russia. And nowhere in this document, and I'm going to link to it in the description, God forbid you go into the NATO website to read the whole thing, but feel free to Google it and read it anywhere else. This is from the NATO website. And here's the main point. So here's a summary of the main things that they agreed to in this treaty. To achieve the aims of this act, NATO and Russia will base their relations on a shared commitment to the following principles. I'm just going to yada yada these because they aren't relevant. First of all, refraining from the threat or use of force against each other, as well as any other state, its sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence in any manner inconsistent with the United Nations Charter. And this one is the kicker. Respect for sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states and their inherent right to choose the means to ensure their own security. The inviolability of borders and people's rights of self-determination as enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. Does this sound to you like a statement made between one side agreeing not to expand into the other side's backyard? No, it doesn't. Nothing in this treaty, in this act, says that any former Warsaw Pact or ex-Soviet state could become a part of NATO. So this idea that NATO made an agreement to expand, to not expand into, the former Soviet sphere of influence is factually incorrect. This is not an interpretation. This is not an opinion. It's factually incorrect. He is wrong about this, absolutely wrong about this. And it's amazing that he can just, go out and spout these basic tankie talking points without offering any evidence whatsoever. He didn't even say, what treaty, what act, what agreement was involved in this. Show some goddamn proof of where you're getting this talking point from. Because there is no agreement. NATO never agreed to this. And NATO's expansion into the former Warsaw Pact, happened just a few years after this treaty was agreed on. So this idea that NATO expansion violates some treaty is wrong. And the sad part of this video is that, as we will later see, he bases his entire solution to this conflict on the idea that, by the way, we might not watch the whole video because it's kind of pointless and it's pretty long, but his conclusion is that the West's response to this crisis should be to honor that agreement, this non-existent agreement. Anyway.
And ever since we gave them our word on that, we've gone back on our word. And in fact, NATO has crept closer and closer and closer to Russia's border. Now, from the Russian perspective...
Now, this idea of NATO creeping as if it was NATO who expanded, at the point of a gun to all these former Soviet satellite states, that's not what happened. These countries made the decision that it was in their interest to join NATO. And again, if you respect the sovereignty and self-determination of nations, you should have no problem with this. But apparently, like every other fucking tankie, you do have a problem with this. You don't like countries to decide to ally themselves with the West. You only like it when they ally to the West's enemies. This is bullshit. I'm sorry, this is bullshit. You know, you're not a leftist if you think this. You're just not. I'm sorry, you're not. It's like I said, a inviolable principle of being a leftist is that you should respect the sovereignty of any country on this planet. And if you can't do that, you're not a leftist.
This is an act of aggression. And again, it's not too hard to figure out why. If we had Russia with weapons in Cuba or Mexico or Canada, and those states were nominally either neutral or aligned with them, we would view that as a provocation.
Now, look what he does here. He's not saying whether he thinks this would be wrong, because if he said, I think this would be wrong, then he would immediately his argument would collapse, because it would not be consistent with his ideas of this is a bad thing that the US and NATO is doing to Russia. Therefore, it would be a bad thing if other countries did it to us. He's just saying we would, i.e. the existing State Department mentality, the existing national security establishment, the existing military-industrial complex would have an issue with it. But he's weaseling out of saying what he thinks. This is so fucking cowardly. So fucking cowardly.
So that's the Russian perspective on this. Hey, NATO, get the hell off our border. Stop, effectively threatening us here. And you can see where they're coming from, because it's not like the U.S. actually abides by international law and doesn't act in a thuggish way globally. In fact, this is a point that Putin has made repeatedly over the years. The U.S. has 900 military bases around the world. We fund 73% of the world's dictatorships. We effectively have puppet governments that are aligned with us in 73%.
And that does not make Russian imperialism good. Okay? This is also what I can't understand about tankies. A bad thing is a bad thing, regardless of who does it. Every argument that they give about US imperialism, I agree with. I do think US imperialism is bad. I don't think the US should have 900 bases around the world. I don't think the US should be funding dictators around the world, especially in my side of the world, Latin America. No other region in the world has been more affected by US imperialism than Latin America. No country on earth has been a bigger victim of US imperialism than Mexico. Trust me, I do not like US imperialism in any way. But the same principles that I apply to what has been done to us, I apply to any other country in the world who is being faced by a bigger, more powerful neighbor that has pretty malignant interest, that wants you to be a satellite state to them, that wants to decide what type of government you have, and who that government appeases. That is absolutely unacceptable, because I would find it unacceptable if the US did it to us, as it has done for the past 150 years.
Of the world's dictatorships. We're expansionist. We ignored international law in Iraq and in Afghanistan and with the 8 countries that we're currently bombing. And so for us to say, hey, look, you got to abide by international law, but then we violate it on a Tuesday before brunch, that's beyond hypocritical, and your word has no weight when you act like that. Now, the perspective from the West is Vladimir Putin basically wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union, or maybe even go beyond that and take over all of Europe. And, you would see...
I saw a very funny tweet that was immediately discard any political analysis on the Russia-Ukraine crisis that begins with Putin wants to reconstruct the USSR. And I kind of agree with it. It's such a cheap talking point that, again, I'm not surprised that Kyle is bringing it up.
There are people deranged enough to make Hitler analogies and comparisons. That's really his ultimate goal, is to take over all of Europe, perhaps all of the world. I think that's really hyperbolic. But now we're stuck here in a standoff. Now, in his heart of hearts, does Vladimir Putin probably want to reconstitute the Soviet Union? I think that's probably true. But I also think it's true that he understands that that's not politically viable or feasible, given the strength and power of NATO, and you can't do that without World War III. However, we saw a similar thing happen when Russia invaded Georgia. I think that was under George W. Bush. Georgia, not U.S.'s Georgia, Georgia the country. And of course, we saw with Crimea in, I believe it was 2014 under Barack Obama. And what happened is Vladimir Putin went into Crimea and effectively said, well, this is ours now. And it is true, this is a part that's, kind of buried in Western media. It is true that the area that he took over, regardless of what you think of what he did there, the area that he took over is basically ethnically Russian. And then when you ask the people in the area that they took over, something like over 70% of them said they would prefer to be with Russia, because Ukraine, like a lot of the post-Soviet states, are kind of fake states. And there's all these disparate factionalized regions that don't have a sort of national unity. And what we're talking about now...
What the hell did he just say? Ukraine is a fake country? All these post-Soviet states are fake countries? You gotta be kidding me. Every single Soviet, former Soviet republic was defined as a Soviet socialist republic at the time, precisely because it had a distinct identity, very often racial identity, and almost in every case, linguistic identity that separated them from Russia. That's why they became Soviet socialist republics under the USSR, whereas they were simply part of the Russian Empire before. Now, this is really strange that he describes Ukraine as a fake country when... Does this look like a fake country to you? Does it, all that blue is the people whose main language is Ukrainian? I mean, the argument of Crimea being essentially, a Russian outpost in the Ukraine is not untrue. Again, the question of whether Crimea should have been allowed to be part of Russia, I would argue that if there had been a sort of independence movement or a separatist movement there that undertook this decision democratically, perhaps I would be fine with it. I'm not fine with it when there's a referendum held on leaving Ukraine, sponsored by Russian troops that just invaded a couple of months before. So no, that's not the way that you do it. And again, if there's any violation of a NATO-Russian treaty, it's this, because Russia violated these 2 points right here when they took over the Ukraine. Anyway, again, does this look like aside from the areas in the Donbass region, which is the areas which are being fought by Russian separatists, funded by Russia and supplied by Russia, Ukraine seems no different ethnically than, even less so than, or rather is more homogeneous than the US. It is more homogeneous than the USSR was back in the day. And let's this map is the USSR. Let's just forget about this bit here, which is Kazakhstan and all these the Central Asian ones, and forget about the Ukraine. But if you look at the part of this map that was that is now just the Russian Federation, there's also some pretty big ethnic variety here as well. Look at these outposts of Ukrainians all the way here. Perhaps they should be independent. Perhaps they should separate and be part of the Ukraine. I'm sure all tankies would support this, wouldn't they? What about Chechnya? Every single tankie loved it when Russia went in and crushed Chechnya. But by the same logic, this is a completely different ethnicity, different religion, even inside another country. Do they not deserve self-determination? Again, this is, I'll say it again over and over and over again. This is what I fucking hate about tankies. Their lack of principles, their lack of consistency in what they argue for. It is basically just US bad, Russia good. That's it. That's their entire worldview. And Russia will get away with anything, absolutely anything. Invade your neighbors? That's fine. Bomb brown people in Syria? That is fine. Crush independence movements inside your own country? Perfectly fine. Be an authoritarian, nationalist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. regime? That is perfect, as long as you're an enemy of the US. Anyway, let's continue.
Now, with the part of Ukraine that Vladimir Putin looks poised to take over, it's a similar situation. And in the case of Crimea, he did it because the Russians needed access to a critical port that was there.
Wait, what? Now you're justifying the invasion of Crimea because you need an extra port. Are you not aware that the largest port in the Black Sea is Russian? It's Novorossiysk. I think I pronounced that wrongly, but that is the largest port on the Black Sea. It says so here. It's the largest port in Russia and the Black Sea Basin, and third in Europe. But no, apparently for Kyle Kulinski, they need another port, which I assume he's referring to Sevastopol, which used to be the base of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. No, apparently, you know, look at imagine if the U.S. decided, you know what, we kind of need a port in Veracruz, Mexico. So let's just invade Mexico and take a chunk of Mexico, so that because we need that port. That's literally what this dumbass is arguing. This is unbelievable. Unbelievable that he is okay with Russia taking over the Crimea because they needed another port.
That, you know, they view it as, well, if Ukraine aligns with the West and you have like American warships in this port that's right here by our doorstep, that is beyond an act of aggression, that's, you know, almost close to an act of war, it has us boxed in totally and completely, and they fear that the West wants to topple their government. And why?
So apparently the fear of the Russian government is that the West is going to topple Putin? Is this a joke? Is this an absolute joke? There's literally no way that the West can topple Putin. Like, no fucking way. And again, he's like, oh my God, this is the paranoia. Oh my God, Russia's being boxed in by all these other countries. No mention whatsoever that Ukraine is literally boxed in by Russia from every direction. You have the separatists on the right in the Donbass. You have the Crimea in the south that's now taken over by Russia. You have Belarus in the top that has also is a Russian ally, and there are currently Russian troops and aircraft in Belarus as well. You have the Transnistria, the breakaway state in Moldova. So you also have Russian troops to your left. Yeah, how is this not you're boxed in? Why is Kyle and every other tankie dipshit worried about Russia being boxed in when Ukraine literally is Ukraine's reality right now? This is their reality. This is where the 100,000 troops are surrounding it. This is crazy. This is demented. Absolutely demented argument.
Wants to meddle in their affairs.
Okay, I skipped a good chunk of the middle part of this video because it's really irrelevant. I want to get to his final argument, his final point, because it's ridiculous.
I really think the best thing that we could do is go back to the original deal when the Soviet Union was broken up, go take NATO back to where it was in, 19...
The fictitious deal that he could not provide any evidence that it happened.
1995, and just keep it there. And have the buffer states, be neutral.
So, in fact, it's worse because what he's asking for is NATO to basically undo treaties that it had with sovereign states, which, all in the sake of this imaginary treaty that Kyle and so many tankies think exists.
And leave it at that. Now, if in that situation, in other words, if we give into and agree to the reasonable asks of Russia,
they're not reasonable.
Well, then we'll take it from there. And you know what? Hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe when we do that, if we do that, then Russia tries not only to take over ethnically Russian areas, which is one thing, but also goes further and actually tries to reconstitute the old Soviet Union by force. Well, in that instance, the second that, he gets to a NATO country, all bets are off, and then you do have World War III. And in that instance, that wouldn't be the fault of America. That wouldn't be the fault of the West. That would be the fault of Vladimir Putin, because he would have goals that are too expansionist for peace. And if that's the case, that would be my commentary. But as of right now, that's not the case. And the asks, I think, are perfectly reasonable. And unfortunately, I don't think the West is gonna honor these asks, which are fair. And I think he's gonna go into Ukraine, but I think he's largely gonna go into just the ethnically Russian areas of Ukraine. which it's not a good thing that he's going to do that, but he's going to do that. And then you just have to hope that Joe Biden is as reasonable as Barack Obama was, and you don't start a war, and you don't engage in kind where we can have escalation to the point of absolute catastrophe.
So apparently Kyle is fine with Russia just taking over the the sovereign territory of other sovereign states, insofar as it's majority Russian speaking people. Again, I guess he would be fine with Mexico taking over all the sort of yellow orangey bits here, which is every U.S. county that has a majority Mexican ancestry. I guess that would be fine, wouldn't it? I'm okay with it as a Mexican. I'd be fine to see the Mexican Empire reborn. But would Kyle be okay with this? This is very, very strange. Again, there are ways in which people can seek self-determination, but getting invaded by a foreign country is not one of them that I would support.
Because in the nuclear age, you can't have two nuclear armed powers in a hot war, because it's too dangerous. And we're all at risk if we do that. So you just have to hope that, because I do think since the West is not going to agree to the reasonable asks of like, go back to original NATO and stop expanding towards our border. Since the West is not going to do that, I do think Vladimir Putin is going to go into Ukraine in the ethnically Russian areas. And I just hope Biden's smart enough not to escalate from there, because that would be devastating. But look, honestly, based on what Biden said there, it appears like his instinct is the same as mine, where he says, look, if it's just a little incursion, then, what are we going to do? Let's not start World War III over that. He said it. I just hope that the pressures behind the scenes from the deep state are not too impenetrable where he feels like he has to react in kind, which could make everything go out of control. So anyway, there you have the breakdown. I really hope cooler heads prevail. This is a dangerous situation for the world. And
so what's the difference if Russia invades the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, and then just decides, oh, maybe I want a tiny little buffer beyond this? Would that be fine with Kyle? Would that be fine with Joe Biden? Because he seems so nonchalant about this. He's like, yeah, okay, fine. It's all right. It's all right for any country to be invaded by its big bully neighbor, insofar as the territory that they steal is only the part that speaks their own language. This is unbelievable. Unbelievable. And yet, like I said, everything that you just heard in this video could be taken practically ad verbatim from any tankie dumbass that you see on Twitter. That is the quality of analysis that you have here. It's just pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. I don't understand why people listen to this guy. I don't understand why. But yeah, there you go. Again, if you don't believe anything that I just said, do your own research. Go and look for this fictitious NATO-Russian treaty. And if you can find it where it explicitly says that NATO cannot expand into the former Warsaw Pact or Soviet states, please, I would love to see the link. I will happily correct myself. But I have enough experience in this area to know that treaty does not exist. It's one of those myths that has just appeared out of nowhere for some time now, but it's just not backed up by any factual agreement. And again, I will repeat my main criticism of tankies, and that is they are not consistent. I really hate people who are not consistent argumentatively, that they don't have a consistent set of principles that you apply to every case. I think as a leftist, one has to stand against imperialism in all its forms. And when I say all its forms, I also mean all its imperialists, not just the US, not just the West, not just Israel. Anyone who bullies another nation, especially a smaller, weaker nation, that's its neighbors, that is imperialism, and it should be condemned. No matter if you think US Western imperialism is worse overall for humanity, which I agree it is, just because they have more capacity to undertake this imperialism and do it even through non-military means, like economically, financially, etc., culturally. So yes, I would agree that Western imperialism is a bigger threat to global security than Russian imperialism. But just because I think that does not mean that Russia will get a free pass for anything that it does. And in this conflict in particular, Russia is the aggressor. Period. So I don't know what else to add, but yeah, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to this channel. If you disagree with what I said, feel free to comment. And again, I await this this imaginary treaty. Please please prove me wrong that this treaty exists. So on that note, see you next time.